This is the Life for Pot podcast. This is a podcast dedicated to explaining how people get sentenced to life in prison for crimes involving marijuana. If you are like most people, you probably don't know that the United States has a number of people serving life without the possibility of parole for what are essentially victimless crimes. Beth Curtis has spent the last 20 years learning about drug laws and the criminal justice system. She became involved with the subject when her brother, John Knock, was indicted by a grand jury in the Northern District of Florida. It was a place he had never lived or worked in. John was ultimately convicted and sentenced there, where he received a sentence of 2 life terms plus 20 years in prison. That happened in the year 2000, and after 8 years of appeals, Beth started the organization Life for Pot. Hi, Beth. Welcome to your podcast.
Thank you, Tom. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, you got into this because of your brother. Tell us who your brother is.
My brother is John Knock, and John was indicted in 1994 in the Northern District of Florida. And that was a place he'd never been, and he was indicted as co-conspirator with a French citizen by the name of Claude Duboc. We didn't have any idea why John was indicted. He was out of the country at the time, and that was when we started looking for answers about criminal justice.
Okay, your brother got 2 life terms plus 20 years. Now, isn't that some sort of record for a nonviolent marijuana-only conviction?
Well, of all the marijuana convictions of offenders that have received life without parole for nonviolent offenses, that's the longest I've heard of. I've never heard of another inmate who got 2 life terms plus 20. I have heard of inmates, as a first-time offender, I have heard of inmates who've received 2 life terms. Actually, it really hardly matters.
You can only do one.
You could only do 1 life term, so probably 5 would be just as reasonable.
Well, he sounds like a dangerous guy. Can you tell us more about him?
John's a wonderful nonviolent individual. He's my younger brother. He's 68, so that makes me pretty old. But I've never seen him an act of violence on his part. He's courteous, responsible, and fun to be around. So, of course, I was shocked. The whole family was shocked when he was charged with conspiracy. Really, although I was looking for information from the time that he was first indicted in 1994, I really didn't feel like making a public inquiry until after he had completed all his appeals, and that was at the end of 2008. So about 2007, I started looking in earnest, for other inmates who had received sentences of life without parole for nonviolent marijuana-only offenses. And I found them. And it was quite surprising. I was surprised to find them. And I was surprised at how appealing these offenders were when I became acquainted with them and started contacting them. I wanted to spotlight them, so I started looking around for groups that had done that in the past, and I found an organization called the November Coalition. A friend of mine knew Nora Callahan, who had started November Coalition, and called her for me so I could talk to her. And I told Nora what I was thinking of doing, and that I thought that I'd call the site Life for Pot. It sounded a little bit out there, and Nora said, "It's really edgy, but it says exactly what you want to say. If you want to focus on inmates who are nonviolent, who have life sentences. But I want to tell you that probably nobody will believe that there aren't dead bodies somewhere." And she was right. Most people do not believe that the criminal justice system in the United States sentences nonviolent marijuana offenders to life.
Yeah, and John's trial was actually for conspiracy.
That's a very interesting part of it. And that did not jump out at me for quite a while. But after 3 or 4 years, I started to notice that all the nonviolent drug offenders, and I don't mean just marijuana, because I vetted them. Everybody who told me there was a nonviolent or marijuana offender, I vetted them to make sure that it was marijuana. Not because I think that nonviolent cocaine offenders or crack offenders should receive life sentences. I don't. They're in the same category. But since I had called it life for pot, I wanted to make sure that the people that I spotlighted were marijuana offenders. So I vetted hundreds of cases and read a lot of inmates' legal documents who received life sentences as nonviolent offenders. Almost all of them were charged with conspiracy, and almost all of them had exercised their Sixth Amendment right to trial. A conspiracy charge is almost a charge about who you know. You're held responsible for acts that are done by a group of people, not necessarily what you did yourself. You may not have participated in the activity, and you may, in some cases, may not even have known about it. But if you were associated with the individuals who did, you can be found guilty of conspiracy.
And it sounds a little bit like a thought crime, but when John was indicted, tell me about the amounts that were used in his indictment that might bring life for pot.
When John was indicted, he had 3 indictments: conspiracy to import marijuana, conspiracy to distribute marijuana, and conspiracy to money launder. In the 3 conspiracy charges, there were no amounts. They didn't give an amount of the money that he laundered, they didn't give the number of pounds that he distributed, and they didn't give the number of pounds that he imported. The indictment simply said conspiracy to import, distribute, and money launder. So they were very nonspecific and left wide open for any future interpretation, additions, etc.
Well, was he found with any specific quantity of marijuana?
No, actually, the case was developed by a reverse sting. And for anybody who's not familiar with what a reverse sting is, it's actually an act that is initiated by generally a government agent, where they go to an individual that they think might know someone or have something to do with someone who has a controlled substance, and they ask them if they can purchase it or ask them if they would be willing to sell something that they have. So the actual crime is initiated by an agent, and and then it goes from there.
In John's case, it was cooperating informants who brought this case forward.
In John's case, it was I think he was an ex-law enforcement officer in Florida, and John had never worked or lived in Florida at any time. He didn't know the individual who was trying to get a plea agreement.
And the weights that were left out of the indictment, why is that important for sentencing? Is there a weight requirement for getting life in pot?
Yes, depending on the weights, you can be sentenced as a kingpin, depending on the amount of marijuana or other drug that you import. It has a lot to do with the sentencing.
And John was actually sentenced for things that weren't even crimes in the times covered by the indictment, right?
Well, the money laundering, I understand it. The indictment, I think, was from 1982 till 1996, and I don't believe that particular charge was against the law until 1992.
And John had retired by 1992.
John had stopped importing anywhere or having anything to do with it. About 1987.
In your research, have you found this has happened to other people?
Well, that was the interesting thing. As I started to accumulate inmates who had nonviolent marijuana offenses, who had received life sentences, I had to read lots and lots of legal documents for many inmates because I vetted them all, and I wanted to make sure that if I put them up on a Life for Pot site, that their charge was definitely for marijuana. And so I went through hundreds of documents for hundreds of inmates to find the marijuana-only offenders who were nonviolent with life without parole. And as I started to accumulate them, I realized that not just the nonviolent marijuana offenders, but other nonviolent drug offenders, the nonviolent cocaine offenders and the nonviolent crack offenders who received a sentence that doesn't fit the crime, life without parole for a nonviolent drug offense, had almost all been charged with conspiracy, and almost all of them had exercised their Sixth Amendment right to trial. So those two factors in their charging, prosecution, and sentencing made a huge difference in what their life would be.
Now, I noticed on your website you have lists of other people who were named as kingpins and did not receive life without parole. How does a kingpin get away with it like that?
I did find many guys who had, and actually these were the life sentences went to men, and I found many of them, and those who did not receive life sentences generally had plea agreements. So even though prosecutors called them the largest kingpin ever found in the West Coast or the biggest marijuana importer in the world, and they gave them all kinds of descriptions, even though they had those descriptive tags on them, they were not sentenced to life, and that was because they made plea agreements and they did not go to trial.
And they didn't receive sentencing enhancements like for going to trial. And there's been some talk or articles put out by judges talking about the trial penalty. Isn't that true?
Yes, and I wish I could give you names and dates and point you to the articles, and I could if I were not talking off the cuff here. But I think more and more people in law enforcement and prosecutors and in the judiciary are talking about disproportionate sentences and the trial penalty.
And the only way to not have a disproportionate sentence is to become what's called a cooperating witness.
Well, that certainly gives shortens your sentence. Yes.
Well, that's all we have time for now. Be sure and join us for the next episode, where we talk about asset forfeiture and the government's ability to seize money and property on Life for Pot, the podcast.